Hey all, this is the Poor Sports Seattle podcast, and today we're going to talk about what I think the Seahawks offseason plan should be. It should be some blend of what I think the Seahawks might do, what I think might be realistic for the Seahawks, and also what I would like to see them do. But I do want to point out, for the second straight video, Dan Viens has the jump on me. Just yesterday, as I'm recording this, he put out his offseason plan once again to avoid infecting my mind with his ideas that are usually very good and certainly better thought out than mine. I have not watched it yet, but go check that out. I'm going to have Dan hopefully on the podcast either later this week or next week. But in the meantime, we are going to talk about what I think the Seahawks should do and what they might actually do here in just after the song. Before we get to the main event here, what I'd like to talk about is the shows that I have coming up in the Pacific Northwest. I had a show in Washougal. That show is officially canceled for low ticket sales. I did have a great time, by the way, in Arlington, Texas, and Portland, Oregon. I will, however, be at the Black Raven Brewing Company in Woodinville, Washington. Please come out there. And then I'll be at Tacoma Comedy Club opening for Jordan Fisher March 20th and 21st. By the way, if you know anyone in Hartford, Connecticut, I'm going to be out there opening for Stephen Ho. First time going out there, going to check out some New Haven style pizza. And then I'll be with Gabriel Rutledge at the Emerald City Comedy Club in Capitol Hill in Seattle. Brand new-ish. Not even brand new anymore. It's maybe close to a year old. The new comedy club smell is wearing off of Emerald City Comedy Club. I'll be out there with my friend Gabriel Rutledge. That'll be a fun time. That's all my dates for March. Come check me out, please. March 14th at Black Raven Brewing, by the way. I don't know if I said the date. Now, let's get into this video. And I made another one of these, what I think are funny. I would hope that the Seahawks would also think they're funny, but maybe they would not. I'm trying to get this old. There we go. Now we're dialed in on the way that this should look. So this is an AI generated image of John Schneider drinking in his office, which I will say I could understand why perhaps the Seahawks or John Schneider himself might not find this funny. I think John Schneider, first off, is a Hall of Famer, so I'm not here to shame him. And I think it's very fun that the Seahawks have like a dude that gets it in as their general manager. This is what you want when you're like probably not when you're a kid, but like as you approach adulthood and you maybe approach, your post-21, post-legal drinking age. That's what you want, is a job where you can kind of, have some fun. Enjoy yourself every now and then. John Schneider certainly does that. Very funny, the images of him or the videos of him at the parade going, "I'm already fucked up." That was amazing. All right, so this is what I think the Seahawks offseason plan should be, and what we're going to start with is what I think the Seahawks' top needs are. We'll go over them very quickly. I think their top need is I think they need 2 to 3 edge rushers and a big pivot point, and the reason why this is the number one need is if DeMarcus Lawrence decides to retire, I think the Seahawks have a big problem. They're losing Boye Mafe. Who knows what's going to happen with Uchenna Nwosu? I mean, maybe they'll decide to keep him. It's about $10 million in savings and I think if Lawrence retires, it's possible that Uchenna Nwosu becomes like a no doubt going to be a Seahawk. He had an okay year last year. He was healthy for most of the year, healthy for the whole year, basically. I would, when they signed him, I wouldn't have expected him to be still on this contract at this point in the contract. This is late in the contract. It's kind of rare that NFL contracts see themselves to fruition. So that's where we are with so you got DeMarcus Lawrence potentially retiring. Uchenna Nwosu maybe doesn't make the roster at a $20 million cap hit, $10+ million savings, whatever we talked about in the free agency video. And then Boye Mafe is a free agent. Those are 3 guys you potentially need to replace. And one thing the Seahawks have never had in the John Schneider era, though they've pursued it multiple times unsuccessfully, is like a truly dominant pass rusher, a truly dominant edge rusher. So I'm hoping they'll address that in the offseason. There's a couple different options. Obviously, the one that's getting the most press at this time is the potential to trade for Max Crosby. I'm not necessarily against that out of hand, but I have some concerns. We'll talk about those in a little bit. I said I was going to go through these quickly. I'm getting very long-winded. I think they need 2 to 3 cornerbacks. This is not a surprise. Tariq Woolen, Josh Jobe, both free agents. And do you think Nehemiah Pritchett is the next guy? Because can you go out? I guess the question is, can you go out and replace those guys? Should you re-sign both those guys? I'd probably be inclined to say no. And if you can't re-sign them, then you probably want to try to replace them with cheaper guys who can perform up to that level or close to it. Either cheaper or perform up to that level or close to it and be a similar price. We'll talk about that in a moment. 1 to 3 running backs. It seems more and more like the Seahawks are going to let Kenneth Walker walk. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that, even with the idea that Zach Charbonnet might not play until midway through next season or maybe miss all of next season. He did tear his ACL very late. Even with the idea that Kenny McIntosh is coming off of a torn ACL and has not proven himself to be a productive running back. Even with the fact that there are no productive running backs presently on the roster, I am okay with letting Kenneth Walker walk if he's going to be making $10+ million. Frankly, if he's making more than probably $7 million, I'd be okay with him walking. If they sign him for a 3-year, $27 million deal, which I've seen projections of that magnitude, I'll grin and bear it. I won't love it, to be honest with you. I don't like the idea of committing long-term or large money to running backs. And I know 3 years doesn't feel like long-term. 3 years is a long time in the NFL. 1 to 2 wide receivers. This shouldn't be a surprise. First off, they really didn't have a great option after Cooper Kupp this year. Torrey Horton looked like it at points. Rashid Shaheed, they brought in mid-season, and 15 catches in 9 games. That's all I got to say. 15 catches in 9 games, to me, does not make a guy, and we'll talk about him more as we get to the offseason plan, but I would also be okay. The projections I've seen for Shaheed are 3 years, $42 million. He's, very good in the return game. I think you could certainly overpay very easily for someone being very good in the return game. Never got into the rhythm of the Seahawks offense. Is he too redundant with Jackson Smith and Jigba? Maybe. Would he benefit from another year here? Maybe, because Clint Kubiak's gone. The guy who he was comfortable with. The guy who we kind of all thought, because Clint Kubiak is here, he'll hit the ground running in Seattle. Well, he didn't. He made a couple big returns, made a couple big plays. I'm not denying that. But as far as if you're going to commit to a guy for the next 3 years, will he be a very productive receiver? Will he be a second receiver worth of salary, productive receiver? I don't know. I think they need, so I have guard, center, and tackle on here. I'm going to make the caveat that I think it's possible that that person comes from Anthony Bradford, Christian Haynes, Olu Oluwatimi, Bryce Cabledew, guys who are already on the roster, but they just need some sort of depth at each one of those positions. Josh Jones is leaving, and I don't necessarily think the Seahawks should be out signing swing tackles to guaranteed multi-million-dollar contracts when they have the depth that they have on the offensive line. Now, if they're going to release Christian Haynes, if they're going to completely give up on Christian Haynes, it's a different story. If they don't think Bryce Cabledew could fill in at tackle in a pinch, that's a different story. But as of right now, I think they have promising prospects that are cheap that could fill in at every spot across the line. But I would not be against them trying to upgrade the right tackle the right guard starter, the center starter. I'm okay with Jalen Sundell. There's a lot of numbers. I'm going to talk a little bit more with Dan Viennes about Anthony Bradford, because I think that both sides are kind of getting it wrong on Anthony Bradford, to be honest with you. And we'll talk about that when I talk to him. And then they obviously need, with Kobe Bryant leaving, even if Ty Okada steps into that role, they need another safety. They need more depth. I think you want... So when the Seahawks drafted Devin Witherspoon. He ended up in the slot kind of out of necessity because Mike McDonald and Pete Carroll, like that nickel guy was very valuable and he's really good at that. And they didn't really have that guy on the roster when Carroll was here. And that guy's really important to Mike McDonald. But it wasn't because he couldn't play outside. It was because it was out of necessity that he played in the slot. Because the NFL has a lot more targets going to the slot than it did in, the 1990s or whenever people have gotten their preconceived notions from. I think similarly, Nick Eamon-Wari is really great in that role, in that nickelback role. I think you'd get diminishing returns if you move him to a traditional safety spot. I think he would be worse, and I think the team would get less from both positions. So you got to get a safety somewhere along the way. Be that in the draft, be that in undrafted free agency, be that at the end of free agency. I don't think you need to go spend big money on a starter. This is why these are way down the list. And similarly, linebacker, I just think you want competition at that position. If they went into next year with Ernest Jones, Drake Thomas, and Tyrese Knight as 1, 2, and 3 in that off-ball linebacker depth chart, I'm fine with that. That works for me. But you got to have some depth at that position. So, anyways, and the tackle I think is the reason tackle's in last place is because I think Bryce Cabledew could handle tackle for a couple games as well as Josh Jones did potentially. I also think that if it push really came to shove, you could probably put Gray Zabel at left tackle for a couple games. He played tackle in college. He's not ideally suited for there, but short arms and whatnot. He's built more like a guard, but I think you could scrape by with the guys who are presently on the roster. But again, worth looking into. I don't think there's a need to draft a tight end. I don't think there is a need to draft a defensive lineman. And so I think that's now, I could certainly see a scenario where I was happy that the Seahawks drafted a true nose tackle, especially if they do it late. If they drafted a high upside guy that was just the top of their board, that was an interior defensive lineman, I'd be fine with that. But it's not a pressing need, I don't think. Okay. So these are the signings, and I want to just note, as the pictures change, please enjoy them. If you're not watching on TV, or not watching on video, I got these AI generated images of John Schneider. Also, by the way, as you're watching, there's a banner rolling below. We did not do a comedians roundtable last week. I don't know if we'll do one this week, but as Seahawks and Mariners events occur, as Seattle sports news happens, we'll get Andrew and Corey back on. I've been having a lot of fun with those. I hope you've been enjoying them. Okay. So these are the signings and trades I would make. This is by the way, the prompt was a hungover John Schneider at his desk. And I know some people hate AI. I got negative feelings about AI also. I think for this purpose, whatever, I'm not going to hire an artist to make $300 images for each one of these slides. This is a hungover John Schneider on his phone at his desk. First things I would do, to me, first order of business this offseason before you do anything, the most important thing is to extend Devin Witherspoon and Jackson Smith-Njigba if you can. Technically, the Seahawks don't have to extend them until after next season. Sorry, after 2 seasons from now, because they have the 5th-year option and all that stuff, and the Seahawks have this ethic or rule that they don't extend players until there's 1 year left on their deal, and they've had players try to leverage them out of that rule, and it's never happened. So it's possible that they're not even considering that until the 5th-year option is played out and all that stuff. But if you were going to sign Devin Witherspoon to an extension, my suspicion is it would cost around 5 years, $140 million. The reason I get to that is the annual average value right now for corners, is it Derek Stingley? No, I think it's someone else, but it's $30 million. And I think that Witherspoon is going to kind of reset the market, but not by a lot. So I'm saying he's going to be around $30 million, and then his 5th-year option is around $20 million. So I think the Seahawks would factor that in and maybe potentially exercise the 5th-year option, have the extension start after, so that his agent can still say that he got $30 million a year on the extension, or just lump it in, that 5th-year option, and have the annual average value be slightly less. I could see him getting up to 31, 32 million. I think it's also possible, and we should always be prepared for these scenarios. These negotiations don't always go well. And I think Devin Witherspoon, he's a Pete Carroll draft pick. He's a John Schneider draft pick, but he's a Pete Carroll era draft pick. It is possible that the Seahawks are not as wedded to Witherspoon as they would have been if Pete Carroll remained the coach. And then Jackson Smith-Njigba, I think it's like, I mean, you're talking about a guy who was the best offensive player in football last year, a guy who, especially as people were doubting him in the wake of the DK Metcalf trade, really stepped up. Did more than you could have ever hoped for him to do. 5 years, $180 million. This is, again, based on the rough fifth-year option plus matching the Jamar Chase $40 million a year salary. So 4 years, $160 million plus roughly what his fifth-year option would be. So do you let him, do you ride it out? Whatever. We just talked about it with Witherspoon. So to me, those two things are priority 1 and 1A. I guess if you had to order them, I'd say I think Jackson Smith-Njigba is probably a slightly higher priority, but these are 1 and 1A, in my opinion. And now we get into the sexier, and sometimes you might argue less sexy stuff. I think the Seahawks should sign Trey Hendrickson. I think in recent years they had flirted with trading for him. The value was never quite right. And I think the Seahawks showed good discipline by not giving up. I want to say it was like 2 first-round picks or even a first-round pick for him. And that's kind of where I'm worried about the Max Crosby stuff, which is if you trade the present expected price tag is 2 first-round picks and a player. So I'm not quite sure who that player would be based on who's on the roster. I don't know who that would be. I don't know. I mean, I certainly don't think you're giving up Devin Witherspoon for him. You might, and even in that scenario, it'd probably be like Devin Witherspoon straight across. I don't know if you're doing that because then you really make a huge weakness at a position that's been a strength in the past. I just don't think they have a perfect, obvious player to send to Las Vegas for Max Crosby. And then you have to pay him a bunch of money. You also have to include 2 first-round picks. One of those picks would be next year when the draft is supposed to be very good. Another would be this year, presumably, when the Seahawks only have 4 draft picks anyway. When you could go, is the difference between signing Trey Hendrickson, who, by the way, we'll briefly touch on it. I've seen projections. Pro Football Focus, his projection is 1 year, $21 million. I mean, if that's what Trey Hendrickson wants, fucking fax a contract over right now. DocuSign a contract to his agent right now. Tamper early. In all sports, I think more egregiously in baseball, but in football also, I hate the idea, and this is part of the reason why I don't like the idea of overpaying for Rashid Shaheed. Part of the reason why I really hated when the Seahawks traded for and then extended to a huge contract Percy Harvin many years ago. And I had a blog at the time, and I wrote about it on that blog. That's one of the nicest things about having a blog is that you get to go back and see what your opinion actually was. Because I might have a rose-colored view of what my opinion was. I might be able to kind of, shift my perception of what I thought at the time to make myself feel more right at the time. And that's happened. I've gone back and looked at stuff and I was completely wrong. I've also seen Trey Hendrickson projected at as high as 4 years, $160 million. If that's the price tag, I'm out. If it's 3 years, 90, I'm probably out. If it's 2 years, $50 million, I'm probably in. If it's 1 year, $21 million, I'm in so fast. I hope they're sending him illegal, tree farm money or whatever they're doing with Kawhi Leonard with the Clippers. And then let's get to addressing the Kenneth Walker hole that I have allowed to occur in this plan, which is to let Kenneth Walker walk and take money elsewhere. I want you to know for the rest of this, I'm going to be using the Pro Football Focus projection for these players' contracts. Trey Hendrickson is all over the board. I didn't want to just say 1 year, $21 million because my instinct is that he's probably going to get more than that. By the way, Trey Hendrickson had a kind of rough year last year, but the previous 2 years, he had a combined 35 sacks. This is no slouch. And you don't have to give up a bunch of draft picks and a player on your roster. And I don't know what Crosby's cap number would be if he came to Seattle, but I imagine it's not free. It might not be $21 million, but it's not free. So here's what I would do to solve the Kenneth Walker problem. I've liked Kenneth Gainwell since he came out of college. I think I might have actually. So I've made some typos that are pretty funny on this. If you're watching. So the Pro Football Focus has Kenneth Gainwell getting 2 years, $4 million annually. So 2 years, $8 million total. So $4 million, which is probably going to be between $5 and $8 million less than what Kenneth Walker receives. Gainwell is an experienced rusher. He's a very good pass catcher out of the backfield. He's not the kind of guy that's necessarily going to be lining up in the slot. He's not Reggie Bush. He's not Marshall Faulk, but he catches the ball well out of the backfield, was a big option for Aaron Rodgers in Pittsburgh and was similar in Philadelphia. He's got experience in this kind of outside zone scheme and should be relatively inexpensive. And for all that, for $4 million a year, he also has return experience. Another guy I would sign. Raheem Mostert, who's going into like his age 32 or 33 season, which typically for a running back, you'd be like, that dude's done. He's toast. And Mostert hasn't been as good in the last couple of years as he was for a couple of years in his career. He's a late bloomer, a guy who for a 32, 33-year-old doesn't have a ton of mileage on the tires, and who, by the way, last year was also a very good returner, who in his age 32, I think, season was not only returning the ball, which is sometimes a thing that guys don't do for their ego later in their careers, or because they're not athletic enough, he was also succeeding. He was very good in the return game. So that solves two problems. You got two running backs to split carries. If that's where it ends, great. I think you've probably, and Mostert, by the way, played in San Francisco, has a ton of played with Mike McDaniel in Miami, has a ton of experience with that outside zone system. So and brings a veteran presence to a position where you're presumably gonna have some inexperience otherwise. If you bring in Gainwell, you won't. But if you're talking about drafting a rookie and rolling with that rookie and George Halani and an injured Zach Charbonnet, having a veteran presence in that room might be nice. Now to the edge rushers besides Trey Hendrickson. I'd like to see at least one more edge rusher signed in free agency. And I think the Seahawks are in a unique position, not dissimilar from where they were really a little bit before and after they won their Super Bowl under Pete Carroll, where this now becomes a place where you might be able to get veterans to come to chase a ring. Guys who haven't gotten a ring or who haven't had a ring in a long time or who just want to win. Guys who want to play for a winning team, Seattle becomes attractive to. Also, for certain positions, I don't think edge rusher is necessarily one of them, but for certain positions, they become a good place to put up a platform season going into free agency. I put Von Miller in this spot. He's estimated by Pro Football Focus to get 1 year, $5.5 million. By the way, Raheem Mostert is projected for 1 year, $1.5 million. Von Miller projected for 1 year, $5.5 million. I will say I'm somewhat agnostic about Von Miller being the specific guy here. Miller almost signed with the Seahawks last year. Big mistake to not, by the way. I would be, if it's Khalil Mack, I'd be fine with it. Oh, there's another guy further down the list. Well, I would like to see a veteran who is a rotational piece, not someone who's going to be expected to come in and play 700 snaps. A guy who's a rotational piece who can come in and be a productive player, but for maybe 300 snaps in a season instead of 700 snaps in a season. Okay. The position where I think the Seahawks have the most leverage, where they can say, hey, we can give you a platform season for free agency, to me is certainly defensive back. They've had very good success in the Pete Carroll era and in the early Mike McDonald era. Josh Jobe comes off the scrap heap. Reek Woolen continued to be relatively successful. First under Pete Carroll and then under Mike McDonald. I think guys like Asante Samuel and Trayvon Diggs, if the Seahawks believe, and I'm not the one to say this, you may be out there going, these guys are washed. These guys are done. You may be using all kinds of modern slang to describe the lack of talent remaining in Asante Samuel and Trayvon Diggs. And you may be right. Again, these are like avatars for the type of guy that I'm talking about. A guy who has been successful, or a guy who had potential, had heat at one time, that maybe wants to platform a season to get one last contract in his career. And I think both these guys, Asante Samuel and Trayvon Diggs, fit that mold. And I would like to see, we're going to look at who I want the Seahawks to draft. I'd like to see them add a young corner also. But I think having inexpensive veteran depth that's got some upside. I'm not saying Trayvon Diggs or Asante Samuel Jr. are going to be 5-year Pro Bowlers. That's why you're not spending $30 million a year on them. But for 1 year to see if they can figure it out, for 1 year to see if they can chase a ring, both these guys have made some money. I think it makes sense for all parties involved if they want to come to Seattle. And there's other guys. There's other guys down there. And when we talk about the next guy, it's the same thing. I would say Trey Hendrickson is a guy that is the particular top edge rusher available, who I think gets close to, he's 85% of what Max Crosby is, but for like arguably half the cost. Not necessarily all the financial cost, but whatever you value first round picks and the players that the Seahawks would have to give up, he doesn't cost any of that stuff. He just costs money. Beyond that, I like Kenneth Gainwell personally. I've liked him since college, like I said. Thought he deserved more time, more carries in Philadelphia. He's now a free agent coming off the best season of his career. That's a specific guy that I like. Beyond that, Raheem Mostert, Von Miller, Asante Samuel, Trayvon Diggs, DeAndre Hopkins. That's my last guy, by the way. I'd like to see the Seahawks sign DeAndre Hopkins. These guys are just kind of avatars of a philosophy, which is there's some veterans that are going to want to try to win a ring, that are going to want to try to put up a platform here, and those guys fit that bill, potentially. Khalil Mack's another one. I can't remember what the receiver list was. I picked DeAndre Hopkins because his PFF grade was still pretty good. I do wonder a little bit if he's a cultural fit in Seattle. There were a lot of stories about DeAndre Hopkins not practicing. I want to say when he played in Arizona, but it's like, kind of a thing that's followed him around his career. Not certain that he's a cultural fit. Like, he's legendary in the way that Cooper Kupp is legendary, but I don't think Cooper Kupp's skipping practice every day. So DeAndre Hopkins as a stand-in for a veteran receiver who's got some experience in a comparable system, who has a little bit of juice left in the tank. That's what I'm looking for. And finally, I would be interested in the Seahawks. So far the Seahawks, I said they should get 2 to 3 edge rushers, and they've, in this scenario, added 2 before we've even gotten to the draft. Add 2 to 3 running backs. They've added 2 before we got to the draft. Add 2 to 3 cornerbacks. They've added 2 before we even got to the draft. Receivers. DeAndre Hopkins, added 1. In my scenario, they're letting Rashid Shaheed walk. And I'd like to see what Keon Coleman costs. And if you don't know the situation with Keon Coleman, he's a Florida State receiver, interesting guy. He was ran a disappointing 40 time, but then was the number one, generationally fast on the gauntlet drill. Was kind of an interesting guy in the combine interviews, and then fell out of favor in Buffalo. Ended up getting benched. Coach's decision a bit at the end of the year. And then in the offseason, there's been a bunch of conversation as Sean McDermott got fired that the front office didn't want Keon Coleman, that Sean McDermott wanted Keon Coleman, and that's part of what led to Sean McDermott getting fired. And if I'm Keon Coleman, I don't like hearing that. I don't want to hear that going into a season. So Keon Coleman, quality receiver, very different in body type and style from anything the Seahawks have on their roster right now. Outside of maybe Jake Bobo, Coleman's a pretty good run blocker, but a big target, not overly fast, faster than Jake Bobo, but I'm almost faster than Jake Bobo. That's not true, but it's closer to true than almost any NFL receiver that's ever played. So if you call Buffalo and they say it's a second round pick for Keon Coleman, yeah, I'll move along. But if they say it's a fourth round pick in 2027, it's your sixth round pick in 2026 for, I think, 2 more years of Keon Coleman at a pretty inexpensive contract, a guy that kind of adds skill diversity to your receiver room and has a bunch of upside. For that, I'm trading for Keon Coleman, absolutely. All right, we'll move on to the next. So these are the draft picks that I think the Seahawks should make, but I'm going to caveat this because I made 2 scenarios. One is if DeMarcus Lawrence retires, and one is if he doesn't retire. I think that's a huge pivot point in the offseason. By the way, the edges that I had them sign, Trey Hendrickson and Von Miller or a veteran, I'm fine with both those guys. Those to me work whether DeMarcus Lawrence retires or not. You got to add depth to that room. DeMarcus Lawrence also not a great pass rusher. Made a couple of huge plays in the pass game this year. Not an incredible pass rusher. So these are the picks I would like to see the Seahawks make. If he retires, this is a bit of a reach. The Seahawks have a look at these typos. That's why I never could have been a journalist, among many reasons. If DeMarcus Lawrence retires, I like Derek Moore, an edge out of Michigan. A guy who the scouting report doesn't necessarily bear this out perfectly, but his PFF grade against the run is super high. I think a guy who, DeMarcus Lawrence is a real special case of a guy who's just a tremendous athlete that plays the run incredibly well, just long arms and perfect technique and incredibly smart. Derek Moore, to say he's going to replace Derek Lawrence 1-for-1 or DeMarcus Lawrence 1-for-1 is not fair, but a guy who I think maybe steps in and can at least fill that role to a degree. If DeMarcus Lawrence retires, Jennings Dunker is probably my favorite offensive lineman from this draft, a guy who I think could step in and start at right guard for the Seahawks right away. If they have any inkling to move on from Anthony Bradford, which is not obvious that they do, but if they did, Jennings Dunker would be a tremendous replacement, in my opinion. And then Tacario Davis, cornerback out of Washington. Early draft projections, I think this would look like a reach. He had an incredible combine. He'll probably have a very good pro day. I think both him and Ephesians Prysock are going to get underappreciated because they didn't play on an incredible defense. They didn't play. They weren't incredibly productive, but they're 2 guys that I think could be very good in the NFL. Both guys are well above 6 feet tall. Tacario Davis, probably a little more physical, probably a little better against the run, something the Seahawks would value. I suspect that Tacario Davis doesn't make it out of the 4th round. I've seen some stuff where he falls like to the 6th round. If he fell out of the 4th round, I'd be surprised. The Seahawks are never afraid to take a guy around early. And then I have them drafting a running back. I'm actually not really, it's the 6th round when they only have 4 picks. So I'm somewhat ambivalent to the idea of them drafting a running back versus finding high priority undrafted free agents. And if you're a running back and the Seahawks didn't draft a running back and you see Zach Charbonnet injured, and even if you see a guy like Kenneth Gainwell and a guy like Raheem Mostert, who I previously said they should sign in the running back room, I'm going Seattle has one of my easiest paths to a successful career as a running back. So the guy I picked is Kalen Black, who's a running back out of Indiana. I like him in particular, but again, this is like a zone-friendly running back late in the draft. There's a lot of them around. So I'm not going to profess that, one, he's even going to be there, though he did not get a combine invite. So I think he might be there. And I guess I'll put up one more caveat. I would like the Seahawks to trade back as much as they can. I'd like to see them accrue more draft capital, especially if they can push that draft capital into 2027, because that draft is supposed to be very good. This one's very bad. And don't let people fool you otherwise. There's good players in this draft, but there's not the depth of high-level talent that there's going to be next year. And then if DeMarcus Lawrence returns, which, by the way, is the scenario I'm rooting for. In that case, I'd like to see the Seahawks draft Brandon Cisse in the first round. He's a cornerback, plays the run well, big, talented cornerback out of South Carolina. He's been mocked to Seattle by a lot of people. The cornerback class drops off, and they probably won't be able to draft a quality corner, the same quality corner in the second round as they do in the first. So in the case where you're not trying to fill an edge spot with a guy who I think fits well, I think more fits well, but where you're maybe less inclined to reach for more than you are for like at the correct draft spot corner, Cisse makes some sense. There's a couple other guys that are likely to be available at that spot. I would say a lot of players will go between 32 and 64 that are defensive backs, that are cornerbacks that would make sense for the Seahawks. Keontae Scott from Miami is another guy who I'd be interested in. He's a little bit older prospect, but I'd be interested in him at that spot. And I do think one thing that's worth talking about as we talk about whether or not teams want to trade up or trade back. Teams trade up the most and spend the most premium on when they're trying to acquire a quarterback. And the Seahawks do have this kind of unique scenario where at the 32nd pick, a team could draft a quarterback and have a fifth-year option on him. At the 33rd pick, they can't. So there's inherent value in getting a quarterback in the first round that doesn't exist in the second round. So if that guy is Ty Simpson and he's gone undrafted, and a team that's not the Raiders but needs a quarterback, the Raiders are going to draft Fernando Mendoza first overall probably. If one of those teams wants Ty Simpson and they want the option for that fifth-year option, I think the Seahawks are in a great spot. That's if he doesn't go earlier, which on talent, I don't necessarily think he should go earlier, but teams draft quarterbacks at a premium. We all know this. This is all well-worn territory. So anyway, this is all assuming that the Seahawks don't trade up. My dreams or trade back. My dream scenario would be they trade back in the first round, trade back in the second round, accrue several picks later in the draft and in 2027, and just find ways to add depth through the draft and not have to pay players to be depth pieces. Deny Dennis Sutton, an edge from Penn State, combine all-star, a guy that I think the Seahawks would have a lot of intrigue on. Big, long arms, tall guy, popped off the workout numbers, not the workout numbers, the what do you call them? The drills. The drills? Anyways, that's not probably right either. But numbers off the charts, and was relatively productive at Penn State. The lack of production is the only reason he's potentially available there. There's a chance that he ends up with these numbers getting drafted higher, maybe even sneaking into the first round. If he's still there, I'd love to see the Seahawks draft him in the second round. There's also the edge class. I do think probably extends into the late second, early third round where the cornerback class drops off. So Jonah Coleman at 96 probably seems like a little bit wishful thinking because I think a lot of projections have Coleman going higher. He didn't work out at the combine. He'll probably do some stuff at the pro day. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't think the testing, that's the word I wanted, the testing. Deny Dennis Sutton popped in the testing. I don't think Jonah Coleman, especially coming off of the lower body injury, I just don't know that he will. I like the player. Chris Polk many years ago has given me a little bit of trauma because I thought he was going to be a high draft pick. He ends up going undrafted because of an undisclosed to the public hip injury that we found out about after the draft that the teams were aware of. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not saying that I think Coleman has that. I wouldn't be surprised to see Coleman drop further than people think. There's many players that fall, especially running backs. Running backs get deprioritized till late in the draft. This is the earliest. The third round is the earliest I would like to see the Seahawks even consider drafting a running back. And that includes, by the way, if the Notre Dame kid was a Jadarian Price, if he falls to them in the second round, abstain. Trade down. Let someone else make that mistake. High value positions earlier in the draft. And then at 212, I had him taking Domani Jackson, a guy from Alabama, played against good competition. Never really had great production, good size, good testing numbers. A project. Absolutely a project. Not necessarily a done deal. Maybe doesn't make the roster, but he's a 6th round pick. That's the breaks, right? Okay. Thank you guys for listening to this. Hopefully I don't hate this enough to not put it out. I will, I'm trying to get the NVNs on later. It's possible that we have a roundtable later in the week if something worthwhile happens. Have some Mariners preview stuff coming up soon. Thank you for listening to this. Casey McLean Comedy. Please come see me do stand-up. More than anything in the world, please come see me do stand-up. Thanks for listening. I love you, and I'll talk to you later.